I grew up in a fairly rural area of Virginia. As a kid, I had an obsession for dirt bikes. Watching motocross on TV, the X Games, reading Racer X magazines, it was all I thought about. So, when my mom and dad bought me my first dirt bike one Christmas, I was ecstatic. From that moment, my days were consumed with riding that thing. As soon as I got home from school until sundown, you can bet I was in the woods riding. Right behind my parents' house was a huge expanse of woods. There was a trail that ran virtually the entire length of our neighborhood. It was a point-to-point trail, with a few turns, hills and jumps. It would take about 15 minutes on my dirt bike to ride the length of the trail from end to end. There were no other trails, just this one long trail. When I got to the end, I would just turn around, go back the other way. I would ride back and forth for hours, every day. I ended up learning that trail like the back of my hand, where every tree root was, where every turn was, where every rut was, you get the picture. When I was 13, I started having this reoccurring dream. I would be riding my dirt bike along that familiar trail, when suddenly, there would be a new intersection. A brand new trail to go down. I would ride down it and come to a large clearing in the woods. In my dream, I had this feeling that when I got to the clearing, I was supposed to be looking for something, finding something there. But every time I got to the clearing, I would wake up. This reoccurring dream continued until I was 14. I left my house one afternoon, hopped on my dirt bike, and began another afternoon of riding back and forth on the trail. I rode for around an hour, when it happened. I was heading up a small hill, mindlessly by this point, knowing everything to expect. Coming over the hill, I saw it, the intersection. I locked my rear brakes, causing the rear end to slide sideways slightly. I couldn't believe my eyes. Was this real? I sat there for several minutes, my bike's motor idling, staring down the trail. 1,000 thoughts raced through my head. How was this possible? Was it always here? Looking down the trail, I couldn't see the end. It went straight for about 50 yards, but I couldn't make out what was at the end. It was as if I couldn't focus on it clear enough, it was just a straight trail. It matched exactly what was in my dream. I decided not to go down it, almost not believing it was really there. I told myself that, if it was there again tomorrow, then I'll go down it. The next day came, and I again ventured out in the woods. I rode straight to the spot where I saw the new trail, fully expecting it to be gone. But, sure enough, there it was again. I made the turn at the intersection, and slowly began riding down the trail. I drove down the trail, staying in third gear, slow and steady. The trail was completely straight, and it only took me about a minute to reach it. The clearing. The exact clearing I always saw in my dreams. Dumbfounded. I stopped, put my kickstand down, turned off the motor, and got off my bike. I took off my helmet, looking around. What the fuck, I whispered to myself. The clearing itself was a perfect circle, around 50 feet in diameter. It was surrounded by dense forest, minus the single trail leading to it. I couldn't make sense of this. I thought I was losing my mind. I walked around the circle, confused, contemplating what it all meant, and looking around for answers. I began to feel an eerie feeling, as if I was being watched. A feeling of dread and danger. I felt as if I was suddenly somewhere I was very much not supposed to be. Fuck this, I said. I threw my helmet back on, not bothering to buckle it, and then kick-started my dirt bike, bringing life back to the motor. I peeled back down the trail, shifting gears and hauling ass back home. I rode for a few minutes, when it hit me. Why the hell is it taking so long to get back? It took less than a minute to reach the clearing, yet I've been riding down this trail for what I felt like was several minutes, and I hadn't met back up with my familiar trail. I started to panic, getting disoriented. I told myself, maybe I'm going the wrong way. I knew it didn't make sense, but I was willing to try anything to get out of there. I spun the bike around, and within about 10 seconds, I made it back to the clearing. "Fuck," I said. I peeled around again, back down the trail. Again, I rode, and rode, never making it back to the intersection. I stopped, got off my bike, feeling defeated, confused, and scared. I threw my helmet and collapsed next to a tree, sobbing. On my knees, I let out a frustrated and terrified scream. I sat there, trying to think of what to do. I'm not sure how long I sat there for. It felt like hours. I could see the sun dropping in the sky, the woods getting dimmer. I started to feel like I was never going home. I closed my eyes, and somehow, probably out of mental exhaustion, fell asleep with my back against a tree. I'm not sure how long I slept for. I woke up, immediately jumping to my feet, wildly looking around and quickly gathering my bearings. The sun was shining brightly, and I was back on the trail. My trail. My blessed familiar trail. The intersection and the new trail was still there, but I was out. Quickly, I jumped on my bike, riding as fast as I could to get home. I had no idea how long I was gone for, and thought my parents were probably worried sick. Exiting the woods by my house, I parked my bike, and ran inside. "Hi, honey," my mom said. "I'm sorry, I don't know what happened. I lost track of time. I managed to get out." "Well, it's only been an hour. I'm surprised you're already back inside," my mom said. I stood there, mouth agape, staring at my mom. "You, okay, Mom?" I asked, a look of concern growing on her face. I forced out an awkward smile. "I'm fine, just not feeling well." I went to my room, a million questions running through my mind. I spent the next few days confused, replaying every moment through my head. I wanted to just make sense of everything, to have some logical reason, but there just wasn't one. I devised a plan that, looking back, was incredibly stupid, but I couldn't live with not knowing what the hell happened to me in those woods. My dad was a bit of a tool co-insurer. Any tool, hardware, rope, bungee cords, he was your guy. Among his collection, he had a giant spool of yellow polypropylene rope, around 600 feet of it. I decided I was going to use the rope, tie it to a tree at the intersection, and then ride back down the trail to investigate. The rope would serve as my lifeline, helping guide me back when I was ready to leave. That day, I went back out. Getting to the trail intersection, I tied one end of the rope around my waist and used several bungee cords to tie the spool to a tree, giving me slack but staying secured to the tree. I headed back down the trail. Feeling a new boost confidence and determination, I rode back down the trail, and quickly arrived back to the clearing. I kept one hand on the knot on my waist, being sure it stayed there. I got off my bike, leaving it idling, and walked into the middle of the circle. I started to get that eerie feeling again, as if being watched. I shook it off, a new feeling of bravery. I felt determined to discover what it was I was supposed to find, and what the point of all of this was. I forced down the feeling of dread. Scanning the clearing, I suddenly became fixated on one tree in particular. This tree was darker than the rest, almost looking burned. I got closer to it. Flaky black scorch marks covered the tree. I was staring at the tree, almost feeling stuck in place, when suddenly, something began slowly peeking its head out from behind it. The face was black, burned, decayed, inhuman, like a bad imitation of a human. It had short wiry black hair that looked oily and covered in soot. As soon as its eyes met mine, my dirt bike's motor shut off. The sudden silence caused me to turn around to look at my bike, then I quickly turned back. The thing was gone. The woods were silent. For a split second, I froze, until instinct in my body kicked in and told me to get the fuck out of there. I sprinted back to my bike, kick-started it harder than I ever had. I half expected it to not start, but, to my relief, it actually started. I left my helmet behind. Riding as fast as I could, the image of the thing's eyes burned in my mind. A shade of orange, like fire, looking into them had made me feel as if I was being sucked into an endless black pit. In my haste to leave, I made a fatal mistake. Having walked a good ways past my bike into the clearing, I had created too much slack in the rope when heading back in the opposite direction. I was shifting gears, going faster, when suddenly, the rope caught my chain. My rear wheel locked, and I was sent over the handbars. Although in pain, I got to my feet as quickly as I could, dirty, limping, a burning pain in my ribs. The rope was still tied around my waist, but it had somehow been severed in the crash. Frantically, I looked around for the rest of the rope, the end that would lead me back, but it was just gone. I ran back to my bike, trying desperately to get the pieces of rope out of my chain and sprocket. When I saw it, movement from the corner of my eye. I stopped, froze, looking in the direction of the movement. I then saw more movement, again, out of the corner of my eye. It was as if it was anticipating my moves, staying just out of eyesight, darting between the trees. I took off running down the trail, abandoning my bike. My adrenaline was pumping, and I knew I was running for my life. I then spotted the yellow rope. The beautiful yellow rope. Yes. I screamed, running as quickly as I could toward it, following it to salvation. But the rope began retracting, dragging on the ground, back up the trail. No. I screamed, running as fast as I could toward it. I ran after it, as it seemed to run away from me. I was hoping to see the intersection, praying to see the intersection, and then I did. I reached the intersection, crying, heaving, trying and failing to catch my breath. For a second, I felt pure relief for making it out alive. But I noticed something. The yellow rope. The spool was no longer bungeed to the tree. The rope now led to behind the tree. Slowly, it stepped out from behind the tree, revealing itself in its entirety. It was the thing from the clearing. The woods went silent. A feeling of pure dread came over me. It had a look of pure malice in its gaze and a terrible smile as it continued to gather up the rest of the yellow rope. I was frozen in fear. I felt as if I was in ice water. I couldn't catch a breath, couldn't scream. I can only describe what I saw as a distorted imitation of a human. Black, charred, its form twisted and contorted into a grotesque mockery of life. Its eyes were pools of endless darkness, devoid of empathy or humanity, gleaming with an ancient predatory intelligence. It began to move toward me, slowly. Its steps were silent, as if the ground itself recoiled from the touch of its feet. The air around me grew cold, and carried the stench of decay. With each movement, its body shifted and rippled, as if it was struggling to contain its own shape. Its presence filled me with overwhelming dread, a primal fear that seized my entire being. Its voice was a twisted mixture of a whisper and a scream. I felt as if its gaze seeped into my mind, into my very being, turning my thoughts into twisted and nightmarish desires. As it approached closer and stood over me, I knew I was going to die. Everything went black. I woke up back on my familiar trail. The intersection was gone, the rope was gone, no trace of anything was left. In shock, and in pain, I walked back home. In the end, I told my parents I had crashed my dirt bike, and wasn't strong enough to push it back home. My dad went back into the woods to look for it, but never found it. I didn't care, I was never going to touch another dirt bike for the rest of my life. Since then, everything was felt different. I felt like something was missing in me, as if that thing took something from me. I felt unable to enjoy anything, unable to have relationships, unable to care. I couldn't sleep, I didn't feel tired, I couldn't feel anything. I didn't know what to do, I just felt like a shell. That Christmas, my family and I were getting ready to leave for a Christmas tree farm, an annual tradition that used to bring me excitement. My parents were trying their best. They saw the change in me, everyone did. Putting on brave faces, my parents asked me if I was excited to pick out our tree. I wasn't excited. I couldn't be excited about anything anymore. "Sure," I said, trying my best to sound convincing. Before we left, my dad was digging in the garage looking for something. "Hey bud, have you seen my yellow rope?" The question sent me into a flashback of full terror, leaving me screaming, sobbing, and begging for help, begging for it to stop. From then on, I spent years in and out of therapy and institutions. I'm an adult now, but I've never shaken the feeling of pure emptiness. I decided I'm going to go back to my childhood home, back to that familiar trail that I can still remember like the back of my hand. If the intersection is there, I am going to down it. I'm going to kill that thing and get back the piece of myself it took. If it kills me, taking the rest of me, so be it. Either way, I'm going to be free of this. I closed the door to my Atlanta apartment for the last time, with only a single black backpack with me. A dingy, 200 square foot studio apartment. It smelled like decades-old cigarette smoke and mold. You wouldn't know it by the single twin-size air mattress on the floor, but it had been my home for the past 2 years. Regardless of what came next, I wasn't coming back. I placed my key on the desk of the front office. Paula, the property manager, gave me a dismissive wave, not bothering to look up from her phone. I left the office, anxious for what was to come, and began my walk to the bus station. As I walked to the bus station, I looked around Atlanta for the last time. I often watched other people going about their daily lives. I would see couples living happily in their much nicer apartments, and I would wonder how different my life would have been if I had never gone down that trail. Maybe it would be me, happily married, in a nice apartment, or maybe it'd be me in a suit and tie, walking busily to an important business meeting. I would always quickly bring myself back to reality though, my reality, a nightmare. I felt a tinge of anxiousness, fear, and anticipation for what was to come. In a way, it felt good to actually feel something, even if it was fear. I got on the bus and settled into my seat for the 400-mile journey back to my hometown. "Hey buddy," the bus driver said, as he stood over my seat. "Rise and shine, time to get off." I sat up in my seat, rubbing my eyes and frantically looking around. "Relax man, you're here, the ride's over," the driver said. I looked out the window and saw the familiar sight of the Blue Ridge Mountains in the distance. Stepping off the bus, the sun was shining, the mountain air fresh. There was a slight breeze in the air, and, by anyone else's account, it would have been considered a beautiful day. To me though, the mountains held an ominous, dark feeling. The sun felt oppressive, and I was half expecting the breeze to carry that dreadful smell of decay to me. It took me one Uber, and one ride on the back of an old man's tailgate to bring me within walking distance of my childhood home. Honestly, I wasn't even sure if my parents still lived there. I wasn't even sure they were even still alive. Walking, I passed familiar houses, remembering friends who once lived there, and recalling times of riding bikes, playing football, and being a carefree kid. A mix of anger and sadness began to creep over me, nostalgia, fear, and hate all bottled up into one. A tear came down my face before I quickly wiped it off, trying to hold steadfast in what I was there for. I arrived at my old house. It looked different, repainted, with new siding and shutters. The old concrete driveway was now asphalt, and if it hadn't have been for the house number, I would have almost questioned whether it was the right house. I didn't bother knocking. It didn't matter who lived there, if it were my parents or strangers. I wasn't here for that. I walked through the side yard of the house, gripping tight onto my backpack, and entered the woods through the backyard. I stepped into the woods for the first time since that afternoon, so many years ago. I walked some ways, looking left and right, and located that old, familiar trail. What was once a clear dirt trail was now overgrown. Grass, thicket, and fallen trees now covered the trail. If I did not have the trail memorized, it would have been hard to follow. It was almost sad, seeing the trail in such a state. Memories of afternoons riding back and forth washed over me, and I almost remembered that feeling of happiness for a moment, when my memory took a turn, bringing me back to the horrible, hideous face of the thing from the clearing. I walked along the trail for around 30 minutes toward the direction of where the intersection to that cursed trail was. The way to the intersection took much longer on foot than it had all those years ago on my dirt bike. As I got closer to the spot, I saw through the trees and the brush, something in the distance, something that didn't match the rest of the forest, something bright, lime green. Approaching it closer, I recognized it immediately. It was my dirt bike. Kawasaki lime green. What the? I whispered to myself. The bike looked exactly as the day I had left it, not even a single spot of rust or look of abandonment. It was as if it had just been frozen in time. The yellow rope that had once been tangled in my chain and sprocket was now gone, and the bike looked as ready to ride as ever. The bike sat right at the T intersection in the trail. For a moment, I couldn't believe the trail was actually there. Looking down the trail, it still looked flawless. The dirt was clear, and unlike my old trail, not overgrown or changed in any way. The two trails contrasted each other, one old, overgrown, one clear, clean. I knew if I got on my dirt bike, despite it being seemingly impossible, it would start up for me. I knew it was an invitation, that the thing knew I was coming. I decided to leave the bike there, having no desire to do what that thing wanted me to do. I started down the trail on foot. I walked down the trail, looking back as my dirt bike got farther and farther away. The farther I got down the trail, the less sound the forest made. The sound of the breeze flowing through the leaves, squirrels darting through trees, and insects and birds chirping, all began to fade away. Only the sound of my footsteps against the dirt and my own breathing remained. My head was on a swivel, fully expecting that thing to jump out at any moment. But nothing. I felt nothing, no feeling of dread, no bad smell, and no feeling of anything watching me. The woods were quiet, and, by all accounts, I was alone. As I approached the clearing, I stopped and took my backpack off. Kneeling down, I unzipped it, looking inside at my can of lighter fluid, matches, and my knife. I pulled out the large bowie knife I had purchased at a pawn shop in Atlanta for $10. It was a bit dull, and the handle was a bit wobbly, but it was the best I could do. I clutched it tightly in my hand as I stepped into the clearing. Looking around, I prepared myself for a fight. But again, nothing, I was just alone. Getting frustrated, I yelled out, trying to sound as intimating as I could. Come on, motherfucker, I know you're here, I'm not a kid anymore, come out. Silence. I began to question my sanity. The sight of myself was ridiculous. An adult, crappy job, crappy apartment, no relationships, no money, wearing old clothes, clutching a shitty dull blade, yelling at nothing in the middle of the forest. My confidence began to fade, my arms began to drop. I stood up straight, coming to the realization that maybe I really was just crazy, maybe everything that happened to me really was just in my head. I saw only trees in the clearing, no burned tree, no monster. My eyes welled up with tears, a feeling of relief and realization finally hitting me. It was time to go back, to finally get help from my obvious delusions. I dropped the knife, and turned around to head back up the trail, ready to finally put this behind me. I turned around. Behind me, standing only a foot in front of my face, were dark, black, hateful eyes. It stared at me, unmoving, a look of pure malice and satisfaction in its face. Its charred, black, terrible face. Before I could move, before I could scream, before I could even think, it grabbed me by neck, driving me back against a tree. It showed its teeth, black, ancient, sharp, a mix of a smile and a scowl. The familiar stench of death and decay surrounded me, and it let out that familiar whispered scream. I clawed at its hand, trying desperately to free myself. Tears were rolling down my face, and I struggled to get in a single breath. Its body was dry, hot, and I felt as though my knuckles were burned every time I tried to punch at it. Ember and ash came off his body every time I hit it. He only smiled bigger, driving me down to the ground, scraping my back against the tree. The tree began to grow hot against my back, turning back into the black, burned tree of my memories. I heard a cracking sound, as if its body was breaking and taking on a new shape. Its body rippled, contorted, releasing fumes of rotted meat with every crack. Its fingers began to grow, longer, sharper, looking almost antler-like. My eyes grew wide, terrified of what was to come next. It seemed to sense my terror, feeding off it, pleasuring itself from it. It drove its newly grown claws into my ribs. A burning sensation of pain like I had never felt before surged through my body. I let out a primal scream, and in that moment wanted nothing more than the relief of death. It felt its claws inside me, tearing through my insides, when, suddenly, the pain disappeared. Its grip loosened, and I began to slowly open my eyes. I breathed deeply, catching my breath, recovering from the painful horror I had just experienced. The thing stepped back a few feet, giving me space, allowing me to stand up. I looked over myself, expecting to see blood, but I was fine. Now that I had a moment to process what I was seeing, I examined the thing in its entirety. Black, decayed, its skin seemed to flake and peel. It had black sores all over its body, and patches of black oily hair on its head and body. Its eyes were black, with a predatory glow. It stood only at about 5 feet 5 inches, but it looked strong, fast. Its smile was gone, and instead just stared at me, mouth half open, like it was just waiting. I stared back at it when I suddenly began to feel something. That thing, whatever it had took all those years ago, in that moment, it had given it back. My soul, my being, whatever you want to call it, I had it back. Suddenly, ever feeling, every emotion, every heartbreak, everything longing or feeling of love, everything that I ever would have felt in my life, all caught up and hit me at once. I collapsed on my knees, crying, half laughing, half sobbing. In that moment, I finally felt like me again. I opened my eyes to find the thing still standing there, staring at me, mouth open. I didn't understand. I was trying to comprehend why it had given it back, why it had restored me. For a moment, we just stared at each other. The side of its mouth began to twitch, a smile growing on its face. Its eyes changed, stopped glowing, growing darker. Its mouth began to salivate, and drool ran down its chin, like a wolf about to eat its kill. I understood then what it was doing. It had given that piece of myself back to me, only for the pleasure of taking it again. It wanted to give me hope, only to have the ultimate prize of again ripping it away, this time worse. It wanted to feed off my emotion and my fear. It didn't just want to kill me, it wanted everything from me this time, my body, and my soul. It wanted me to suffer for having the audacity to come back and think that I could stand up to it. I wasted no time to run. Down the trail, I ran as fast as I could. I looked back to see the thing gone, out of sight. I stopped then, knowing full well I wouldn't outrun it, and I went back to the clearing. The answer had to be in this clearing. What did the tree mean? What did my dreams mean as a child? I looked around, knowing my time was limited. I picked up the old bowie knife, and I walked in circles around the burned tree. I was looking for anything that could provide me something, when I spotted a small, hand-sized stone sitting behind the tree, at its base. Tiny symbols had been carved into the stone along with a single word, Lakota. I heard a rustling from the branches above me. I looked up, and I saw it. In the tree, kneeling, balancing on a branch like a cat. It lunged down, a blur of feral rage and supernatural speed. It drove me to my back. Its feet were on stomach, hands on my chest, and it knelt, its face only a few inches from mine. I felt as if I could hear the screams of 1,000 people in its mouth, when it spoke to me for the first time. Its voice sounded harsh, whispered, like it was coming from the vocal cords of something long dead. Unkaisai's yellow, is all it said. Its mouth began to water, body began to crack, when I yelled, Lakota, as loud as I could manage. It stopped, looking at me, eyes growing wide, a look of pure hate and realization. It began to breath heavily, it was furious. I stood, and it began to back away. Its look of hate turned to something else. Was it fear? I knew then that I had done something right. I began to slowly advance toward it. Again I yelled, Lakota, and it began to retreat backward further from me. I lunged, driving the blade of my knife deep into its chest. It fell on its back howling in agony as the blade found its mark, searing through its black flesh and bone with a satisfying finality. It thrashed and writhed, its unearthly cries echoing through the woods. I pressed my advantage, stabbing it again and again, its body crunching, chunks of its black ashy flesh falling off with every penetration of the blade. The stench of the inside of its body was nearly unbearable, causing me to gag, but I kept stabbing. It finally stopped moving, stopped breathing, its predatory glow finally leaving its eyes. I looked around the forest, a feeling of skeptical relief washing over me. I went and retrieved the lighter fluid. I poured it all over the now mangled body, all over the clearing, and all over that cursed tree. I lit it on fire, and turned down the trail to leave. The trail was gone now, only thick woods stood in front of me. The flames grew bigger behind me, and I walked in the direction of that old familiar trail. On my way back, I came across my old Kawasaki, now on its side, yellow rope tangled in the rear wheel. Brush and moss had long taken it over, and the motor was covered in rust. Goodbye, old buddy, I said, and headed out of those woods for the last time.